Facts didn't fit the theory.
We actually had a decline in temperature from the 1940s through to about the late 1970s to about 1980. When all this while, CO2 levels were increasing like crazy all around the world.
We've been inundated so much by the argument that CO2 is driving temperature change in the 20th century. CO2 in the atmosphere is such a small proportion that there needs to be some amplifying effect.
If you take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller. The atmosphere is made up of a multitude of gases. A small percentage of them we call greenhouse gases. And of that very small percentage of greenhouse gases, 95% of it is water vapor. It's the most important greenhouse gas.
Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, by far the most important greenhouse gas.
Why aren't we told that?
Here's another contentious claim in your film. Again, it's based on the historical record. You claim that the period between the 9th and the 13th centuries was hotter than today. Let's look at that.
Before the Little Ice Age, we find a balmy golden era, when temperatures were higher than they are today, a time known to climatologists as the medieval warm period.
Between about 1400 and in some places as late as 1900, there was a period of colder than average temperatures over many regions of the world called the Little Ice Age. Before that, there was a period of unusual warmth.
So that created a very familiar curve that appeared in the early IPCC reports.
Towards the early portion of the record,
our general perception of the climate in the last 1,000 years is that it was warmer in the Middle Ages than it is today, and that we emerged from the Little Ice Age about 140 years ago. Glaciologist Jørn Peter Steffensen knows a bit about that. He's looking for clues about the climate in the past in ice core samples from Greenland.
When we remove or drill the ice core, we leave a hole, and we insert a thermometer in the hole. We are able to map out the temperature through the 3-kilometer ice sheet. This ice is from the Viking Age, around the year 1000, also called the medieval warm period.
Now, do you still stand by that claim?
Yes.
Here's what our climatologist said about that.
When I saw this picture, which shows the medieval warm period warmer than now, and the right-hand side says now, this picture's 20 years old. All the data since then has come off the top.
There is little doubt that the last 5 or 7 years has been warmer than any time in the medieval warm period, and that's what we're absolutely certain about.
So to show a graph that's 20 years out of date, not to show what happened at the end, not to report the reports, that's just a lie.
Why did you use a graph that was 17 years old when you could have used more modern data which shows what's happened in that past 17 years?
Well, firstly, if you look at what's happened in the past 17 years, you don't find a huge change. I mean, we've got to get this thing in perspective. When we're talking about temperature change in the past... No, hold on. Then when you're talking about the temperature change in the past 150 years, you're talking about a temperature change of just over ½ degree Celsius in a very noisy record where the error bars are very considerable. So when you talk about temperature change in the past 20 years, you're talking, in terms of our knowledge of the climate history of the last 1,000 years, of a very tiny amount of change. I'd love to...
We have a very accurate knowledge of it because the instruments are almost perfect. We know exactly what temperature rises there have been in the past 17 years.
That's very untrue. We don't have a very accurate knowledge of it at all. We had a huge problem at the end of the Soviet Union that they closed a lot of their temperature reading stations.
17 years ago we had an accurate knowledge and now we don't. Well, I have a very simple question about your use of this graph because it says it's a chart of the temperature over 1,000 years right up to now. Now, to me, means 2007. But in fact, this graph doesn't go anywhere near 2007, does it?
Well, I mean, you can't just get a graph that's produced by Herbert Lamb on the various statistics and then add another bit of line to it.
You've left yourself open to the charge that you've deliberately misrepresented the graph and that you've left out 17 years of growing temperatures which don't prove your point. The 1990 graph, IPCC 1990 graph you used, was superseded in the second IPCC report in 1995, in the third in 2001, in the fourth in 2007. Why didn't you use one of those?
I'll tell you exactly why we didn't use one of those. They were superseded by graphs which eliminated the medieval warm period. If you look at the sort of the old picture of the last 1,000 years, there's the medieval warm period, it goes down to the Little Ice Age and then up again. I'm trying to do that backwards so that people can understand. What it was replaced with was something which became known as the hockey stick.
But now the IPCC has mooted a new climate history graph. In it, the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age have both vanished. The graph has been dubbed the hockey stick because only the lower end of the line points almost vertically upward. The principal author of this new graph is Dr. Michael Mann. He says the graph is based on computer simulations of the temperature series of the last 140 years compared to old tree ring data.
How likely is it that there was a year as warm as 1998 or a decade as warm as the 1990s in the past 1,000 years, given this reconstruction? And it turns out that when you ask that question, the answer that you get is that it's 95% to 99% likely. That essentially underlies the conclusion of the IPCC that the 1990s and 1998 were very likely the warmest decade and the warmest year in the past 1,000 years.
In 1998, a study came out, which is now referred to as the MBH 98, because the three authors' names, the first one is the one that's spoken about the most, which is Mann, published a report in which they completely rejected that widely accepted temperature graph.
The MBH98 graph became known as the hockey stick curve, where the shaft of the stick was the relatively constant lower temperatures for the first 900 years of the past millennium, and the blade of the stick the reputed sudden temperature rise of the past century. The United Nations and environmentalists promoted it as the smoking gun, that recent warming was unusual.
One of the things about the climate change issue that is a great concern to me is the fact that some of these policy decisions could cost quite a lot and yet have no effect at all on the climate.
The question is why flawed models are used as a basis for enormously expensive policy decisions, far-reaching policy decisions. They shouldn't be.
The science we have is still incomplete, and the science we're being told by the IPCC is really incorrect science.
The IPCC based its conclusions on computer models that attempt to predict what will happen if we double CO2 emissions. The worst-case scenario shows increases of up to 5.8 degrees centigrade. The Earth's atmosphere is the cause of all life on the planet. Without this thin membrane separating us from the cold darkness of space, life on Earth as we know it would be impossible. The greenhouse gases like water vapor, clouds and CO2 retain the heat radiation beamed down to us by the sun. Without these gases, the sun's rays would merely be reflected into space, and the globe would be cold and uninhabitable. The phenomenon we benefit from is known as the natural greenhouse effect.
The sun delivers the main amount of energy to the climate of the Earth. And the atmosphere of the Earth has a greenhouse effect in it, a natural greenhouse effect, that keeps the Earth a bit warmer than it would be if these gases weren't there. The foremost of them is water vapor. Water vapor is the most important of the greenhouse gases. Second in line is the effect of water in clouds, water droplets and water ice crystals. So the natural greenhouse effect has made the Earth warmer and much more pleasant for life on it.
According to the human greenhouse effect theory, the natural greenhouse effect is amplified because the CO2 we emit makes the heat blanket around the globe thicker, and hence it retains more heat, resulting in increased temperatures.
Now, because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, there is concern about whether or not that will enhance the natural greenhouse effect on the Earth, and will it then cause catastrophic climate change to the Earth.